give a warm welcome to the hosts of The Bride of Alternate Ending.
Hello, ghouls and goblins, and welcome back to Bride of Alternate Ending. I am your co-host, Brennan Klein. I'm here with Tim Brayton. Hello, Tim. How you doing?
I'm doing good, Brennan. How are you doing?
I am doing weirdly well, and I'm not going to question it. But today, we're talking about a movie that did not make me feel well to watch necessarily, but I'm very excited to discuss with you. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, not at all.
Whoops. Okay.
I mean, eventually I'm going to say something, but I was letting you go through the preamble first. But yes, we are here to talk about a movie that is sort of consciously designed to make you feel all sorts of bad feelings, physically and emotionally and morally, and I think we're both very excited to talk about that movie.
Look, I love feeling.
What is that movie?
I love feeling morally bad. We're going to be discussing TETSUO II: Body Hammer. This is a sequel to TETSUO the Iron Man from 1989, which we discussed back in July. We had everybody on the Patreon vote as to what follow-up or sequel to a previous film we discussed they wanted us to cover. And for some reason, it was this one.
I feel like that is sort of the biggest lingering question for me out of all the questions that we're going to chat about on this episode relative to this movie. I am curious what was going through our Patreons' minds when this was the option that they slugged us with, because it's a movie.
It is certainly a movie. I mean, I'm glad that the second place contender, 1998's Carnival of Souls, did not win, because I think that would have been a much more depressing episode.
That's probably true.
But this was a first-time watch for both of us, was it?
Definitely. I had seen the original Tetsuo a couple of times before we talked about it, but I have not seen either of its sequels, or had not seen either of its sequels, including this film. And then I'm in 2003, I think, or sometime around then, a third film just called The Bullet Man.
Yeah,
So
I think it was 2010.
An ongoing series
I think
of
it was
films.
really
2010.
late.
Well, anyway, there's a third of these films that I think we should not put on a poll, because I don't want to have to risk watching that one to talk about on a podcast.
Yeah, I think we can slightly control how terrible our life gets with this podcast, so yeah, we can avoid that. But was there a particular reason you avoided watching these sequels?
Just my sort of general belief that sequels are usually a crapshoot, especially sequels for a film as singular as Tetsuo the Iron Man. Mm-hmm. And also just to a certain extent availability. In particular, my sense is that Tetsuo II: Body Hammer has been very hard to lay hands on until really quite recently, like the last 2 or 3 years even.
Oh, that is surprising to me. I mean, I there is one good thing about being like an obscure stuff fan at this point, in that a lot of things are much more easy to find online at this time period. But yeah, Tetsuo II is now like $2 on Vudu or whatever. So I'm happy that it's there for the people who want to see it.
Agreed. And to be clear, I don't regret that I have now seen it. Like, I think it is a film with which to have an encounter and figure out what that encounter meant to you.
Yes, I think so. And actually, the it continues the kind of theme of Tetsuo by dint of being an extremely roughshod experimental franchise, even though that those words apply less to this one. They really kind of break apart what it means to be cinema and have allowed me to kind of wrestle with the things that I like or don't like in a movie, as our previous episode kind of covered, because I was really having trouble with the fact that I did not like Tetsuo the Iron Man. I have much less trouble knowing that I don't like this movie, but I think it's still helping me kind of dive into the crevasse of what cinema means to me, and I think that's important.
That is an important thing to do. And my sense is that if you ever get a hankering for that experience, again, The Bullet Man, I believe, will do more of the same.
But
based on-
shakier, apparently.
But with even more crude and off-putting and unwatchable, like pointedly, deliberately unwatchable aesthetics. So hold that one in your back pocket for a rainy day.
Mm-hmm.
Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, pull it out when I'm feeling sick, not having a great time.
Exactly.
But yes, okay. So what? I guess we should. There is actually a plot in this movie.
There is a much more tangible, describable plot this time around, for sure.
Do you wanna tackle that one?
Well, now having said that, I'm not 100% sure that I can do so in more than like 2 sentences, because it's one of those things where, like, at the macro level it's got a plot, and at the micro level it doesn't necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, a father, his son has been kidnapped, right? And in his rage against the kidnappers, a father either deliberately transforms, or his rage is just so powerful it manifests as his body erupting guns.
Mm-hmm.
And he becomes like a body hammer, if you will. I
don't think I will.
Well, I did. I not only will, but I in fact just did so.
Mm-hmm. More like a body gun, you know.
It was a body gun, but I mean, there are hammers in guns, right? It's the hammer strikes the firing mechanism. So maybe that's what they're talking about. But yes, he turns his body into guns, a gun, multiple guns, depends on the needs of the scene. But he goes and wreaks his vengeance and looks for his son. So it's sort of like, what if John Wick was a body horror movie, only it was a boy instead of guns, or instead of a dog.
Yeah, but wait. Doesn't it kind of become revenge, because in attempting to kill the person who he thinks dropped his son off a building, he actually obliterates his son in the process?
That was my understanding of that scene, yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I get you, spoiler alert, but also, come on. There's no such thing as a spoiler for TETSUO II Body Hammer.
That is fair. That is fair.
But the sight of the obliterated boy hands that the assassin is holding it's a pretty grotesquely amusing moment.
And to be fair, meant to be both grotesque and amusing, I am quite sure.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something. This is the. Could you imagine if they got someone who wasn't Shinya Tsukamoto to make this movie? But yes, this is him just doing his thing, and it continues to be his thing, even though it is kind of like a weird Tetsuo Fantasia on like 80s action tropes more than it is just a experimental film.
That's a great way of crystallizing some things I've had a hard time putting into words, which is how flattening it is to give this movie a plot, I think. And I think sort of casting it as this is kind of a pastiche or a parody of a genre of cinema that is not body horror in a way.
Yeah.
I think that gives me clarity over why that feels so weird.
Well, it really does, because it's much more. It's kind of, it has the flavor of like a Yakuza film more than it does Tetsuo, like a David Cronenberg thing.
Right, exactly. And like, to a certain extent, I don't know that I should hold that against the movie, because we have Tetsuo. Tetsuo exists. And Tetsuo 1 is such a strange and unwieldy and singular object that you can't have two of them, I don't think. Like, the next one needs to be doing other things and needs to be extending itself in some way.
And it certainly is doing that. I do think, like, because I had something to hold on to in terms of plot, I found it a more palatable watching experience, but I also think that dims the exact thing that it's trying to do. Like, as much as I didn't like Tetsuo, I kind of respected Tetsuo. And this one, I was kind of desperately bored by the end. It's also a good 10 to 20 minutes longer than the previous one, which it does not need to be.
It does not need to. I mean, it's not long. It's 81 minutes, but it does feel like even at 81 minutes, he is fighting to get the running time to that point. I agree. It is too long. I would not say I was desperately bored, certainly, but I think your use of the word palatable is very good because it is more of a movie than Tetsuo 1. It is easier to describe in terms of goals, in terms of choices being made, in terms of how things interrelate with the narrative. And it's just less of an assault. Like it doesn't feel like the movie's just going at you so hard. All of which are things that I think steal away the power of the material to a certain extent.
Yeah, it's much less of an assault. It's just kind of loud. It's not upsetting in the way of like moments like that ribbed iron bar being dragged through the guy's teeth in the first one. There's nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going for that. It's definitely going for this kind of gonzo filmmaking quality in the way that it shoots every sequence in the movie, but it's not trying to use that to dig under your to creep under your flesh. It's just doing it to kind of like batter your eyeballs into submission, and that is, if anything, like less interesting of a goal.
I would agree with that to an extent. I think for me the biggest difference between the two films, and at some point I should probably lay out the sort of meta narrative of the Tetsuo films. This one has a lot more plot. The plot that it has is different than the plot that the first movie had, but there is a sense in which the films are doing the same thing. There's the plot's not the reason you go see this. It's not like I want to see a father try and fail to rescue his son. The plot is still very much a pretext for these scenes of sort of bodily mortification and this cyborg hell, right? And all the very striking images in this film are of like pieces of metal coming out of skin. So it's doing the same thing in a lot of ways. But the first movie, the content really is what was sort of hitting me, and it's the way the content's being presented. Obviously, like it's being shot very thoughtfully, and it's these horrifying metal and flesh images are being presented to us in such a way that they do have that impact. But the images themselves are sort of what have power in the first Tetsuo, I think. And in this movie, it's much more the editing is what gives it its power. Like every time I felt like, whoa, okay, the movie just did something to me, it was always in the cutting. Almost, I think without exception, it was in the cutting even.
That's a really good point.
And like when it works, and I don't think it never works. I mean, I think it works often. It's always in a filmmaking sense. It's always like, oh, that's a cool thing he did, or that's an interesting thing he did, or oh, I don't think that thing worked, which was often what my response was. I don't think that thing worked, but I get what he was going for, and it was a ballsy thing to go for. Generally, again, in cutting, and not so much in that sense of like that image is now going to like be seared into my retinas for the next several weeks.
You're right. It's in the way that he smashes his images together rather than how any individual image functions. It's kind of like it's got this kind of like Texas Chainsaw editing style where it's just like really loud and vibrant and clashing into each other. Like I'm gonna cut to this, kind of like circle light opening up onto the camera, or just like the way that he's juxtaposing things rather than the things.
Exactly. And 3 or 4 times during the movie, there's these like, I don't know what else to call them other than montage sequences, where it's like all of a sudden the movie's just like pitching shots at us, and they're disconnected, and they're generally all in some way violent, and they're happening like several times per second. And that's kind of, those montage sequences just by virtue of being montaged and being very fast and being sort of accompanied by this screeching loud noises on the soundtrack, that's where the movie does its like heaviest visceral hitting. Just because it's hard not to sort of feel torn up a little bit by seeing images kind of flying at you at a million miles an hour. And that's, I'm an editing guy. Like I love editing. I teach editing or taught editing. So it's not like I want to shit on it, but I do feel in a film of this sort that feels like a cheat code for getting at that visceral effect. And I like letting the image itself sort of be disturbing, and then the editing can sort of shape how many images and which images and how long that is extended for, rather than the editing doing the work itself. And I think in this movie, the editing is doing the work itself.
Yeah, and in those montage sequences, that is where the images are more powerful anyway, because I think maybe Tsukamoto was struggling with having this kind of like, because the first movie has this kind of like incessant flood of new ideas, and this one, by tying it to in some way a linear coherent narrative, like he kept having to go back to the well of things that he'd already established about, like, this is kind of a consistent character and this is how this character operates, and that kind of structure is not what Tetsuo demands,
Right.
because like you were right. Like there's a lot of stuff about like machine parts bursting out of flesh, but it's basically the same thing happening over and over again in slightly different variations of just different gun barrels coming out of his chest or his whatever. And the I would say the effects of like flesh like stretching or tearing are more. They obviously had a little bit higher budget specifically, and that is where it comes through the most. But the way that the metal is interacting with that flesh is much less ontologically horrifying.
Absolutely. To me, the single most striking moment of metal, like the moment where looking at metal itself seemed to be the most like artistically foregrounded. During one of the montages, there's this like, it's cool looking, and I even as I was watching it, I was like, I don't know how I'm going to describe that when I'm trying to explain this moment. It's like we see an overlay of these bent nails, sort of like a snowstorm of bent nails in front of the screen, and either the camera pulls back from those or they pull back from the camera. It's hard to say, but they sort of like form themselves into a sphere made of these bent nails. And it's a very cool, very weird sort of music video-esque image, but it's also, I think, very conspicuously, again, this was the moment of metal that was like, oh, that's the moment to me. It is not about flesh. Like, metal and flesh aren't even playing together in that moment. It's just this kind of like the visual graphic appeal of these like little silver nails kind of spinning around in a circle.
Yeah, it really does feel like, I mean, actually, okay, wait. You said you wanted to say something about like the kind of meta-narrative story of like outside of Tetsuo and how this came to be, and maybe that will kind of help us navigate what's going on in this movie, because it does feel like his instincts are pushing up against something that's preventing him from fully achieving them.
And you know, I threw out the word meta-narrative. I think it sounds like you have something fancier in mind necessarily than I did when I used that word, because basically what I meant by it was, this is the film of what if I had more money to make Tetsuo the Iron Man.
I mean, no, that's what I meant, like, just the story of how this movie came to be, essentially.
Right. Actually, I don't know the story of how this movie came to be. Like, I know it has more money.
It clearly
you can
does.
see that it has more money. But it is 3 years later. 1992 as compared to 1989 for the first film. It costs more, obviously. It has just more polish. It's a bigger production. This is a film that was shot in color.
Mm-hmm.
And it also just appears that this was a movie that was shot with equipment. And it was a movie that was shot with a crew. And the first movie obviously like he had collaborators and he had, people working on the film with him, but it felt like a bunch of people in an apartment just like regurgitating the stuff of this movie one dark, horrible night, which is of course not what happened. I think the first movie was actually shot over the course of several weeks, because again, when you're working at that kind of budget level, you get, hey guys, I have 80 feet of film, let's shoot two shots, like that sort of thing. There's that sense in the first film of it being some sort of like discarded object that has been like found in a gutter.
Yeah, it feels like it
right?
congealed rather than
Yeah,
was
that's a good word. And that is a feeling, and to me that is actually the most conspicuous difference between the films, even more so than the thing I said about like editing. The first one is a viscerally revolting object even without the content, just because of what it looks like. It's crazy grainy, black and white. It's just like, it's an artless film. It's obviously not artless, like very, very conspicuously made and very consciously made the way it is. But it's this like revolting mishmash of grainy 16 millimeter film and strange, horrifying images and this like really like patchwork grating soundtrack. And TETSUO II feels like doing the same stuff, but doing it as a film production, right?
Yeah, which also opens itself up to more criticism of certain things that are failing. Like, most of the things that are really wild swings in this movie, it's very clear that they're on purpose. But I would say, for me, a lot of the extremely bad lighting in a lot of the outdoor scenes, like, for me, that does not seem like expressionism to me. I think it's just bad lighting,
Mm-hmm. I can see that. I can for sure see that.
Where it's like when the sun is behind an actor and you can't really see their face, I don't feel like that's on purpose. It's just ugly.
I think that's fair. And I think that those moments are conspicuous enough that it is worth sort of holding on to them. For me, this is unfair. There's a sense in which it was all bad lighting because it wasn't the lighting that I wanted. Because it was, it's. I think the color stock they were using, I don't know what color stock they were using. It's not interesting to look at. It doesn't have the kind of textures of just like big swimming grain chunks that the first one had. So the whole thing just ends up feeling to me much smoother in a kind of plasticky way. And how much of that is solely compared to my expectations, and how much of it is that you're giving, I mean, this filmmaking team, they've been working together on these like basically avant-garde shorts, and to an extent this is an avant-garde feature. But I think that these are people who are comfortable working at this sort of like ultra low budget way, and now they're working in a medium budget. There's not a lot of money. This is not an expensive film, but
they have a budget. Someone handed
they
them
have
a 50.
budget. They have a budget, and I think there is an extent to which they don't know what they're doing making a color film. They don't know what they're doing making a film on this stock, and it, I think, leads to, in general, the images aren't interesting to look at to me.
No, they're mostly just not. But we've been living down in the dumps for a while. But you have said that there are certain things that do work for you in TETSUO II.
Oh, sure.
What are some of those things?
Well, I mean, those montages for sure.
Uh-huh.
When he's just like, okay, here's a bunch of crazy ass images, some of which feel like stock footage. Like I think in at least one of them, there's a nuclear bomb stock image, because that's you get to use that. That's a convenient image. It's one you can grab at. And I feel if you're a Japanese filmmaker, it becomes even more sort of salient to grab that image. But a lot of it is things like that sort of snowstorm of nails I was talking about. Like that's a good image. It did something to me. And those are also, I think, places where the movie benefits from being in color, because then we start getting these really strong contrasts of color. And there's one very near the end. It might even literally be how the movie ends. I'm now trying to remember if there's any subsequent shots, but the movie is doing this thing where it like suddenly cuts to sort of La Jetée-esque stills of the actors gathered around, and like the camera like zooms down towards someone's face and then like sort of pivots around them, and then it kind of cuts to show a different angle, and it zooms out and then it zooms back in and then pivots again and zooms back out. And it was cool. I don't know that I could explain why it was there or what it was doing, but it was an exciting thing for me to watch.
Yeah. And those are, I mean, at least, yeah, aesthetically, it's nice to have certain things in this movie that to hold on to. For me, I think the shot that not that I'd call it beautiful, but one of the shots that I thought worked for me the most was when the first time he's hanging off the side of a building, when the gang has first attempted to steal his child at a mall of some kind. He's hanging off the side of the building, and you can see his breath fogging up the outside of the window of the skyscraper. Sure. And that's not machinery specifically, but it is in some way a human being interacting with an object in a way that is chilling. And also, this movie very much likes to prioritize objects. It loves to frame the actors behind things. Like there's a shot of the family eating breakfast the camera is kind of drunkenly swaying behind the kitchen counter and framing them behind like boxes of cereal and things like that. And that I think is interesting.
It is for sure. And to sort of soften what I've been saying, this is not a film made by a bunch of like yokel amateurs who got too much money and don't know what they're doing with themselves. Every shot, every frame of painting, as they say, it is very much, they're composing images. They are thinking very hard about what's going on in the images. It is still a cohesive art object. Like it is still very clearly, they're not like fucking around. Everything they're putting into this movie is doing some sort of work. Everything they're putting in this movie, they designed to look the way it does. It's just that the things they're putting in there don't matter as much to me, I guess is the thing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think you sort of, either you glanced over it, or it just, one of the things you said just now sort of triggered this in me. Very few of the images that are striking to me in this film, they are images, like you say, like the cereal box composition, right? Very few of the times that there's a machine flesh interface in this film, and they do happen. Like this is still a Tetsuo film. Those are not the images that I pulled away from this movie, which is exactly the opposite of the first one. Obviously, where all of the images that matter to me the most are the ones of like, here is wire being scraped across teeth. Here is wire growing out of someone's hand. Here, I can really honestly only think of one shot that was specifically of metal and flesh together that really stuck in my craw. And even that wasn't visceral in the same way that so many shots from the first movie are visceral. And I'm specifically thinking of a shot. It's like a medium, or even maybe a medium close-up. It's sort of like chest and head, where his body has sort of like erupted with this like honeycomb of gun barrels, and he has this really crazed look on his face, and he's got sort of a very bared teeth grin. And that's the one image in the whole film really where it like walloped me in the same way that the cyborg images from the first film was walloping me.
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, I think that's the shot that they hold on for like 8 seconds, and they hold on it.
They hold on it for a while. So they know that it's doing something for sure, and maybe even the reason why it stuck with me is because it was being held on. But no, they for sure hold on that shot longer than a lot of the shots in this movie.
Yeah, this movie is not. It's Tsukamoto is not a patient filmmaker. He doesn't hold on things very often.
Right.
As far as other things that I liked, there were certain aesthetic things that I liked. I think in that mall sequence again, the wife is wearing this kind of like Red Riding Hood cloak that is like this blue velvet. It's just a really interesting costume piece that I liked to look at very much. And then also I think something that feels, I don't know if there's a way to like fully. No, you know what? I'm gonna take that back. I think there's a way to square it with kind of like the actual quote unquote like themes of the narrative of the movie. But there's a very early sequence where the gang is running around and they bump into this businessman and he apologizes to them for them shoulder checking him, and I think that that's very much like in tune with what Tsukamoto's trying to say about like the clash of cultures going on in this movie.
I think that is a good moment to sort of tease out, and it's definitely not a film where I tend to think about the stories being told and like the characters involved, but I think that is a good moment. One of the things he does get out of having such a more like coherent, discussable story is that there are places where what resonates is kind of what's being told and the culture we're seeing and the people we're seeing. And I don't think he goes very far with that. And again, this is still an avant-garde body horror movie by every standard other than does it stack up to the first Tetsuo. But I do think that there are those moments where it does feel a little bit more the world exists and people exist in that world.
That's a great point. But also I think it speaks to where this movie's interests lie in that like that reflection of the theme has to do with a character who isn't in the movie.
Right.
It's just an extra.
Yeah.
So yeah,
featured extra.
Yeah, featured. Yeah, he's SAG eligible for speaking a line. But yeah, so it's just doing its Tetsuo thing, and it's vaguely pointing at things, but it's definitely leaving more of a trail of breadcrumbs than the first one is. And one last thing that I liked, but more just because it was kind of goofy and I enjoyed it. I believe two of the members of the gang who are guarding things, they wear this kind of big, bulky armor that looks like they're dressed up as a toaster. And I thought that was adorable, and I enjoyed them very much.
I have been watching Doctor Who, the rebooted version of Doctor Who these past few weeks. And I loved those outfits because they felt like something that Doctor Who would try to put over. And it really charmed me.
Yeah, there's something about that charming, low-budget sci-fi silliness that's just very earnest. And that actually, it felt a little Mad Max to me. At least maybe Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, like Master Blaster, that kind of, that level.
There's an absolute feeling of like, do we have enough budget to do a Mad Max riff? And the answer was no. But they either didn't figure that out or only figured it out after they already had like shot the footage. But yes, I see exactly what you're saying.
Thank you. I'm so glad. I love clarity of ideas. I don't always have that.
Yes. I do want to. I already sort of shared my a couple picks really for just the single most like indelible image, and it sounds like you've got some in mind as well. Are there any specific images that landed with you that you haven't had a chance to talk about yet?
I mean, I talked about the skyscraper scene. I agree that moment of him just kind of grinning with the honeycomb out of his chest was good. I think the only other sequence that I think, not necessarily a single image, but it is the kind of motion of the set of images, is when he's kind of working out at this gym while his family is watching, and he first starts kind of embracing his machine power rather than his, weak, mild human power. There's this good set of images where he's just like kind of, it's a Tsukamoto freak out where he's just kind of like baring his teeth, and just you can hear these kind of pistons whirring as he's, doing the push-up, whatever that reverse pull-up thing where you push up the bar to lift the weights is. and the energy of that scene, it really felt like his skull was gonna burst out of his head, and I guess it was more of a performance thing, but I also thought that everything kind of worked together well in tandem in that scene.
Sure.
But yeah, otherwise, I don't know. I think I covered everything.
I then have one further question, and this is probably more a question for me than for you, but I do want to sort of wrestle with it for me as well, because I love the first one, which I know you do not.
Mm-hmm.
So not loving this one to me is more, I think, of a bummer than I imagine it is for you, because for me there were stakes in loving this film. My feeling is that I need to revisit it. Not soon. Not soon at all. But I think I entered it with perhaps the wrong calibration, and perhaps not. Perhaps the movie is just the things that we've sort of pulled it apart for being. I am curious if I will like it more now that I know what it's doing, and more importantly, what I know it's not doing. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if you think there's any level of were your expectations just not in the right place for this film, because it is certainly not a satisfying sequel to Tetsuo the Iron Man, and I, to a certain extent, I think that's its fault, but I also do wonder if it's just not trying to be, if it's playing a different game. So that's kind of why I want to at some point revisit it, is to sort of see if my expectations were just misaligned. Do you see that as being something that would ever happen in your life for any reason?
No. I do think that for you, like you said, it is doing all of this kind of 80s pastiche body horror stuff, but it is not doing Tetsuo the Iron Man. So I think that that's going to be a very important distinction for you to be able to separate. But for me, I was kind of hoping it wouldn't do exactly Tetsuo the Iron Man, and it didn't. It just also didn't really give me something that I liked, and that is fine. I do still admire Tsukamoto's kind of like gung-ho cinematic instincts. I don't think they were served as well by what this movie was. But it's just like there is a glass wall between me and him that I can see the promised land on the other side, but I can't quite touch it, or I can't feel it. But this movie, I don't think, is capable of delivering that to me. Whereas I feel like the first Tetsuo is a movie I can crack if I try hard enough.
Sure. That makes sense. Last question. Are you ever going to watch The Bullet Man?
Only if somehow we are desperate enough to put it on a poll and people vote for it. Because with that, I'm going to double check when that movie came out, but I was looking at it right before we recorded, and I'm pretty sure it's 2010. One moment. 2009. So yeah, there is a huge jump in time, and I don't want to see a Tetsuo movie that has a lot of CGI, which could be the case in 2009. And I don't want to see. I don't see a situation in which 20 years later, Tsukamoto has a reason to be making this movie that feels artistically profound.
Okay. I expect I'll probably have watched it within the next 2 months.
Okay. Look,
maybe 3.
I am very excited. If that happens, I will be excited to see what your rating is. And if it's great, I might watch it.
I mean, I'll bet it's not.
I'll
bet
not.
I'll bet real money that it's not.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem like it could be.
Kind of, exactly. And then I do have a couple people on Letterboxd trying to like force me to watch it ASAP,
Which is
and
always
both of them
a red flag.
Always great. Always love it when people who follow me on Letterboxd are like, "Oh, you got to see this film," because it's always, I suspect, because they want to see me suffer. They're not describing it in terms that make it feel like a more edifying experience than the one we've just had. But I'm curious. I'm super curious. He's got a vision, you know.
Yes,
he's got something. He's got a bug up his ass, and he's trying to like express it to the rest of us. And I gotta respect that.
I do respect it too. I just don't know that I need to see The Bullet Man. It does feel
I respect
like
that.
There is a movie that came out, oh God, I think like also in the 2010s called Return to Sleepaway Camp that was made by the guy who made the first Sleepaway Camp.
I happen to know for a fact, because for unrelated reasons, I was looking it up last night, 2008.
2008. Yes, so it's a similar thing where it's way later, and it doesn't have the same grubby inspiration as the first one does, and I feel like Tetsuo III would be the same kind of vibe.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we talked about Tetsuo II Body Hammer enough. Do you agree?
I'm a little surprised we got it this long, honestly. I was like, ooh, I wonder if we're going to get a half hour out of it. And here we are.
Yeah, 8 hours later. But yes, so the follow-up month will continue. Next time
we are taking it away from our beloved Patreons because
cannot be trusted.
Y'all are just fucking with us.
Look, we never promised that the second episode of the month would be like the second place winner, and that is not what it's going to be. Because otherwise we'd have to watch Carnival of Souls, and that's just not happening. We will be discussing Scream 2022, which should be called Scream 5, but is not.
It should be called 5 Scream. I don't know how you'd pronounce it, but
well,
the S should be a 5.
It would be 5 Cream, which is also a title that I hate.
Fair enough, but like you wouldn't. The point being, when you look at a poster, the S should be a 5. Is what I'm saying.
Yes, of course. I completely agree. I also don't like Scra4M, which was the Scream 4 title.
See, I do like Scra4M. So
Okay.
So this is the part of me that likes Tetsuo, I guess. I like horrible, ugly words.
Yeah, I don't know. For some reason, that kind of like Leet speak titling doesn't appeal to me as much as like a silly sequel subtitle does. But yeah, we have our preferences when it comes to sequel titles.
And none of the Screams have had a silly subtitle, so if they started now, it would just feel really weird.
Oh yeah, no, I'm certainly not asking for that. It's Scream 5. Like it's not fucking Scream.
It's not fucking Scream.
Anyway, so and also it's not even whatever. We'll talk about it. Yeah, this will be Bride of Alternate Ending in the Isles. We will be discussing a current theatrical film in (2 weeks, but probably 2 weeks.
All right.
Yeah, no promises. But yeah, that is the next episode we'll be covering. And until then, thank you so much for listening, and we hope you, I don't know, have a good January. I guess we're all
have a good January. Happy New Year. Hope that it's getting off to a good start, and yeah, we'll catch you with some Scream very soon.
Yeah. Oh, and you totally reminded me, because it is 2022. This is the 30th anniversary of Tetsuo II.
It is. So
Great.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary. Bye, everybody.
She hates me.